Cyber attacks and cybersecurity is truly the great equalizer between nations. Whereas beforehand, a lot of the advantages or disadvantages had largely been dictated by the country's existing geography, whether it be natural borders, your agricultural potential, your internal river system, which dictated the price of transport, your access to natural deep harbors, the type of natural wealth you had in your country, whether it's the oil of Saudi Arabia or the iron ore of Australia, or the natural gas of the United States. All of these factors you're born with, right? And they either give you an unnatural advantage or an unnatural disadvantage, like many landlocked countries without any natural resources, just for example. But cybersecurity and cyber warfare equalize that, because why deploy an army when you can just cripple your enemy via a good Wi-Fi connection and total anonymity? Why spend billions of dollars on soldiers when you could rather just meddle in other countries' election and disintegrate them from the inside through disinformation? You don't have to necessarily physically invade anymore. Why risk your life trying to rob a bank when you could just inject a line of code and achieve the same end goal? You know, how did the geopolitics of power change when traditional geography, manpower, and distance become obsolete? So these are the realities of cyber warfare and also the importance of cybersecurity. It's much bigger than simply changing your password. So Lachlan McGrath is the guest on the podcast today. He's the senior strategy consultant at CyberCX, which is an Australian end-to-end cybersecurity consultancy firm. Lachlan is surely one of the leading voices on cyber in Australia, with his interest leaning most heavily towards the national security implications of cybersecurity. Because what makes the topic of cyber so interesting is that it does have implications at the national level as well as the individual level. It really is an all-encompassing issue that we need to be thinking a little bit about more in our lives. In the following podcast with Lachlan, you can expect to hear and learn about some of the following. Why cyber threats must be treated and thought of as their physical equivalents. So I opened with the example of why rob a bank when you could just inject a line of code. It's the same end goal. It's stealing money from an institution, but it seems so much less threatening when it is just done from a guy in another country through a computer. But we have to think about its physical equivalents to truly understand the potential scale of cyber implication. We're going to define all the key jargon so it makes a little bit more sense as it's said later through, starting with things like ransomware, etc. My favorite part of the chat was when we spoke about the geopolitics of cybersecurity, because much is made over how, say, Russia or North Korea will almost stereotypically be involved in all the cyber attacks around the world, when the reality of the situation is that it's a lot more complex and bigger than that. And then Lachlan's favorite part of the chat was speaking about the realities of cyber warfare. He himself says at the beginning of the chat how his main interest is sort of counterinsurgency. So Lachlan comes at this from a real, almost military mindset, thinking about the implications of cybersecurity. So thanks to Lachlan for joining me on the podcast. But since I found you here, since we're met here together on this particular podcast, let's assume that we have more in common than we do not. So I want to corner the podcast for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is you're listening in from. And based off the email correspondence I've had with some of the listeners of this show, the podcast has so far attracted an extremely brilliant, smart, and most importantly, for me, curious people from far and wide. That's also super exciting for someone like me. The fact that there are people listening in from as far as Mongolia to Mexico to Argentina to the United States to Australia to Europe. The possibilities of distribution of the internet is still discounted and undervalued. It truly is an amazing, amazing thing. So let's assume we've more in common than we do not. We found each other here. Pump your good juice into the algorithm. Leave a nice review. Subscribe to the podcast and tell a mate. Tell a friend about the show who you think might also be interested. Because whether it's today, speaking about cybersecurity, or whether it's last week, speaking about Michael Smith and the last correspondent in China for the Australian Financial Review, or whether it's next week, speaking to Jim Henry about blood bankers. My curiosities are expansive, and likely those listening to this show have the exact same predisposition. So I hope that you find something out of this show. So that's all from me. Stay around to the end for my afterthoughts from the podcast. And with no further waiting, here's the man himself, Lachlan McGrath.
Mr. McGrath, Lachlan McGrath, thank you very much for joining me, mate. It's Sunday night for you in Melbourne, Sunday morning for me in Stockholm. and you're a strategy advisor at CyberCX, and we actually went to school together a long time ago.
Not too long ago.
Yeah, not so long ago, about 8 years since we finished, but I really wanted to learn about cybersecurity, and it's, for many reasons, as we're going to get into, a super important thing to know about as well. Even if you're not actively involved in setting up your own sort of defenses for cybersecurity, it is nonetheless something that you should be aware of, because I think the overarching theme is, as we historically understand physical threats as being physical, we have to now think about threats as also being cyber. And with all of us having numerous social media profiles, banking happening through the internet, our work happening through the internet, all of our messages coming through the internet, like, we are really exposed. The threat is real, and so it's worth, trying to understand a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. Our exposure as individuals is growing every day. And I don't think there's anyone out there who would be able to say that they've never received a suspicious text message or phone call claiming to be, it used to be a Nigerian prince scam. Now I'll get calls being like, oh, this is the Australian Department of, National Security, and we're going to arrest you unless you pay this fine.
That's sophisticated.
Well, actually, some of the more interesting ones that's just started more recently is what's referred to as a refund scam. So you'll get a message saying, hey, Amazon is going to charge you your $150 for whatever this is. Thanks for your payment. And then, if you don't want to pay it, give us a call. And then you call them and say, hey, I don't want to pay $150. And they say, oh, well, let me fix that up for you. Let's organize some stuff. And what ends up happening is you end up buying gift cards and stuff like that. But we know that in the US recently, a woman was found to have transferred thousands of dollars to cyber criminals through gift cards. And the reason this got found out was because the staff member at the store where she bought the gift cards had been informed that if people are buying lots and lots of gift cards, then have a look into it, ask them some questions. And the particularly pernicious part about this example was that the woman had been told what to say. So she said to the clerk, no worries, I'm just buying these for my family.
Wow,
and so it was only because exactly. And so it's only because the clerk was like, I'm still not sure about it. He contacted the police. The police went and interviewed the woman, and that's how it got found out. So
what a legend. Standing up for the old woman.
Exactly. So there are some very, very advanced, it's referred to as social engineering attacks when you engage in those scams and stuff like that. So even getting away from the technical stuff, it's getting very, very advanced.
We'll definitely touch on different types of cyber attacks. For me, that strikes me as on the spectrum of highly sophisticated sort of national encryption hacks to the Nigerian prince. That strikes me as on this sort of end of the spectrum, where it's nonetheless, while it is sophisticated, it's still rather it doesn't have scalability to it. It's still one guy calling one person trying to get her information, and it relies on the ignorance of the person on the other end of the phone. And obviously the worst part about this is they, target older people who, for no fault of their own, are just not as sophisticated with the internet and understanding that the threats are real.
COVID has been used extensively for different kinds of these social engineering attacks. And that's because it creates fear in people. So if I send you a text message and it says, there's been, you've been exposed, you've been at an exposure site, click here to find out what you need to do next. You, as a responsible citizen, about someone who cares about their community, someone who cares about their own health, you're very inclined to click on it. And so their goal is often just to get you to click a link, which can be really, really easy. The most popular kind of scam text messages that go out at the moment are ones about a delivery attempt was made. And that's because you can send them out to random phone numbers, because so many people are likely to have deliveries coming, and it'll say, we're trying to deliver it, but you need to pay a few extra bucks. And so often we'll have I'm waiting on a delivery right now, if I got a text, I'd be like, oh, that must be this thing that I've ordered. Mm-hmm. And then you say, $2 extra is not so much in the grand scheme of things to get this thing that I otherwise wouldn't have got. It's that sunk cost fallacy. I've already sunk all this cost into it. What's another $2 on shipping? And then they've got your details. So.
And once they have the details, it's then they use that as like the foot in the door to get access to everything else. Like that's kind of the idea, right? It's not just to get that one-time $2 transaction. It's more the value of what having that information can then get you down the line.
Exactly. And so it depends on what information they get. So if they get your credit card information, they can try and use that for, they themselves can try and use it to make purchases and that sort of stuff. But the stuff that's most interesting that's now happening is I can go online and purchase credit card details that work. And so the attackers won't necessarily use them. They may well get your details and then sell those details on to another cyber criminal specialist who will then go on the dark web and sell those. So whether it depends on the nature of what they get, but it's an increasingly specialized ecosystem, the cyber criminal underground.
Are you well versed on the dark web?
I've been on the dark web.
Wow. Okay. Well, let me bookmark that for later as well. No, because that's also a fascinating corner of the internet, which is also relatively unknown, but quite a lot of transactions happen there, which actually yield significance for the greater scheme of things. But before we go on, Lachlan, I'd like for you to, you've been introduced already, but I'd like for you to just explain your experience both in the public and the private sector, just to add some authority, right, to what you're saying. So if you wouldn't mind...
Is the bookshelf isn't enough?
Yeah, the bookshelf and suit. Look, it's doing wonders for the authority, but let's just double down in case people aren't fooled by just the aesthetics of it. So if you could explain why cybersecurity, but then also what your experience is, and then we can kick on with the stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been interested in security for a while. In terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think security allows people to do what they do best. Security allows people to enjoy life and kind of reach self-actualization in a way that they otherwise couldn't. So I used to be really interested in counterinsurgency. A number of the books behind me, probably too many given my current employment, are about counterinsurgency.
Oh, lovely.
I always thought that was an interesting intermingling of kinetic security, but then also governance and good governance. But then decided that, maybe counterinsurgency isn't the future. Maybe, these computers, they seem like they're a pretty big deal. They seem like they're sticking around. Let's move in that direction. So I did a master's in cybersecurity analysis. Mm-hmm. I'm by no means the most technical person on the planet. And then I was working in politics at the time for a member of Australia's federal parliament. And then I ended up moving down here to Melbourne as policy advisor to the Shadow Assistant Minister for Cybersecurity, so the opposition's cybersecurity spokesperson. Okay. And I finished up there relatively recently, a few months ago, and moved over into the private sector, where now I'm working on cybersecurity strategy. Mm-hmm. So that's where I'm at the moment.
Could you just open up what it means to work for the opposition shadow minister? Because even as an Australian, I don't really know what that means. So you can imagine the international audience could be a bit lost. Obviously, you're an Australian, if that wasn't made obvious through the accent already. But could you explain more about what you were doing in the public sector and then what you're doing in the private sector?
Yep. So Australia has two major parties, the centre-left Labor Party, which I worked for, and then the centre-right Liberal National Coalition, who are currently in power.
Very diplomatic of you to position them as centre-left and centre-right, rather than
just
left-right.
The compulsory voting system of Australia kind of
very good
towards the centre. But being in the opposition means that we don't have access to a lot of the machine of government accessibility, so you don't have access to the bureaucracies or a lot of those sorts of things. Everyone just has their personal staff, which can be quite small. So we were very resource constrained, but our job is mostly twofold. One is to hold the government to account on issues where we think in terms of cybersecurity, they're not doing well enough. But then on the other hand, also promote what we think they should be doing. So we released 2 discussion papers, one on broader cyber defense for Australia, both technical and organizational, in that the biggest suggestion I think out of that one was that Australia should invest in some kind of civilian cyber corps, some part-time cyber defenders who are able, like similar to the Army Reserve, but in a civilian cybersecurity format. And then more recently, we released a discussion paper on ransomware and what the government should do about ransomware. Tim Watts currently has a private members bill going up before Parliament, which would require large Australian companies and government entities to report when they intend to make a ransomware payment. So if they got hit with ransomware, if they intended to make the payment to the cyber criminals, they would have to report a number of different pieces of information to the government. The government wouldn't stop them from making that payment, but they'd ask for a number of bits of information that would give the government broadly a better idea of how much ransomware is costing the economy, and then also provide law enforcement with some more specific pieces of intelligence. For example, the cryptocurrency wallet that is being used. And we're just recently seeing examples where if law enforcement get that information fast enough, they can actually act on it. So, for example, Colonial Pipeline, where the FBI was able to retrieve quite a bit of that, the ransom that was paid.
And then to the private sector.
And now I work in the private sector, so working as a strategy consultant. The best thing about that is I'm far away from the hands-on keyboard, so that's nice. And it's taking a much broader look. So the question I always like to ask is, if an organization was given, $50,000 or whatever to uplift their cybersecurity, do they have a plan for how they would maximize that? What is the next thing that they have to do? What's the thing after that? What's the biggest threat to them? Where are their biggest weaknesses or potential vectors for compromise?
And your clients are big businesses?
Large organizations, government entities, everyone.
Oh, governments as well. Cool. Okay.
Yeah. Everyone desperately needs cybersecurity uplift at the moment, and most entities, whilst they can afford to keep practitioners on hand and IT personnel, they can't afford to keep strategy specialists on hand. So we just come in, provide the strategy, and either the organization itself will implement those aspects of the strategy, or we can hand it off to someone within our organization who can help with that implementation.
Right on. Okay, so there's a resume that qualifies everything you're about to say, which is fantastic. Okay, Lachlan, there's a lot of jargon in cybersecurity. Not surprisingly, you said ransomware in there. I didn't catch any of the other jargon that you said, but I want to start off with some explanations, just because it will make all of the following discussion, I think, a lot more understandable. So, what is cybersecurity? Sorry for such a vague, random question, but I'm sure it's something you actually probably begrudgingly have to answer more than you'd like. What actually is cybersecurity? And then I'm going to ask you about black and white hat hackers, different types of cyber attacks, ransomware, spam injections, all this sort of stuff.
Absolutely. So I think, Ryan, the best explanation of cybersecurity would be anything to do with computers, any way that computers can either be attacked themselves or used to undertake attacks. I think you really well articulated the fact that you've got that human and technical nuance, not quite a dichotomy, where you can have very, very technical attacks, and you can also have very, very human-focused attacks that require very limited technical capability.
But what makes it a cyber attack is it's through an internet, it's through connected devices that you're involved with.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So what about from the very beginning, what is the difference between white hat and black hat hackers?
Black hat hackers are bad guys who are doing this to steal money. White hat hackers are also doing it for money, but they're getting paid by clients. They're often referred to as either penetration testers or the red team, and their job is to...
Penetration testers.
Yeah,
Come on,
so their
surely
job
we
is
could
to
have done a better work with that definition.
thought about that one, said that one out loud a few more times. And so their job is they'll be hired by organizations to come in and try and break into either a piece of software or to a company more broadly. Interestingly enough, you can get red teamers who are physical penetration testers who will physically try and break into your office building or whatever. So that's their job. They're both doing it for money, technically speaking, but some of the good guys and some of the bad guys.
So the white hat hacker is the guy that comes and stress tests the robustness of your system. The black hat hacker is who is actually just trying to come in and take your information and then sell it, or just take your money and then keep it.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. I also want to bookmark that because I want to ask later what is more of a lucrative trade. Because that's also very important to understand where the incentives lie. We're going to better understand how this is going to unfold. Let's talk about, there are many different types of cyber attacks. You mentioned ransomware. So these are the different methods by which someone can attack an online system. Can you explain both ransomware and some of the other very popular attacks that we're likely to speak about?
Yep, absolutely. So ransomware is currently the biggest threat out there. Ransomware is when you will have a piece of malware, the ransomware, malicious software, that will encrypt your computer, and you'll get a pop-up that says, if you want access to your computer, pay this much money. So they're ransoming access to your computer. It's become more of an issue as it's referred to as big game hunting. So Ryan, if you or I were hit with ransomware, we wouldn't be able to pay a huge amount of money. But to go back an example, when Colonial Pipeline got hit, they ended up paying millions and millions of dollars in a ransom. So as the former head of the American Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Chris Krebs, said, ransomware is a business and business is good. So that's what that is. There is a huge variety of other cyber attacks. Some are quite simple, such as what's called brute forcing, where you'll write a program script that or a piece of software that will just try lots and lots of combinations of username and password.
Okay.
The reason why we keep telling people, cybersecurity experts keep telling people to not reuse usernames and passwords, is because what happens is you'll use the same username and password for, let's say, a random shopping site that for some reason has forced you to set up an account and not just letting you check out as a guest. If they probably don't have great cybersecurity, and if they get breached and I can take that, then I can go to your bank, I'll go to all of the bank sites and I'll try those combinations. Or something that happened to some people that I know is I can send an email to that username, which is usually an email, and say, hey, I've got your password, here it is, pay me some money or else I'll XYZ.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of one of the other ones. And then I think the third most common or one that your listeners will be kind of associated with is malicious links or malicious attachments, which if you click on it or you download it or something like that, you give access to an attacker's website or something where they can then send commands to your computer.
Yep.
And so once they can do that, they can basically do whatever they want.
So just so I can understand, ransomware is the malware, but it's the most sophisticated of the attacks because it is very talented black hat hackers creating a software that can be somehow injected into a computer or a system, and it just locks it down. And the only way to unlock it is to pay money, and they'll give you a key to unlock it. Whilst it's locked down, do they also have access to everything inside of it?
Generally not. So there's what's referred to now as double extortion, where I'll lock down your system, but before I do that, I'll exfiltrate. I'll steal a whole bunch of data. And if you don't pay me, I will expose this data on this dark web website I host.
Yeah.
If I'm a bit more creative, I might even email some of your clients and say, hey, I have your data. You should tell that original victim to pay me, or else I'm going to expose your data. I
mean, that's a good way to just seep in the pressure for sure.
Exactly. Sometimes they'll call up and say, why aren't you paying? Or it's any kind of way that they can exert pressure.
So it's like a classic hostage situation. Really.
Exactly. And I was having a discussion recently with I won't say who, but they said, why can't we? They weren't in cybersecurity; they were a political person. They said, why can't people just be better? Why can't organizations just have better cybersecurity? Why are you suggesting the government gets more involved? And I said, because Australia's had a number of hospitals hit by ransomware this year, both in Victoria and Queensland. I said, if a Russian criminal organization went into a hospital with AK-47s or whatever and held the hospital hostage, there's no way you'd say, they should have had
They should have defended themselves.
Exactly. These are advanced criminal actors that are either professional criminals. Sometimes they even work for, foreign intelligence organizations, and they just do this in their spare time. The North Korean economy almost runs off cyber criminal exploits at the moment. So it's a bit ridiculous to suggest that, innocent people, random civilians should be defending themselves from advanced nation state or criminal actors.
Yeah, 100%. And so then you've got the brute force attack, which is someone who writes some sort of script that can do hundreds of thousands of combinations of password and username per second across many different sites. So it's not like it's a guy who's doing very estimated guesses. No, it's done at a scale that humans can't imagine. And then finally is the bad links, and this is probably the one people are most familiar with, because by now at least, guys and girls our age and younger, we can kind of spot spam, at least. You sort of hope that we could spot spam. I guess what we said at the beginning is maybe spam is getting a little bit more sophisticated with the with the delivery packages and so forth. But okay, so you would box those three as the most common cyber attacks.
An interesting thing to say about that second one, the brute forcing attacks, is they are also quite sophisticated. So we know that native English speakers tend to have passwords that start with a capital letter, are a noun, have two numbers, between 2 and 4 numbers, and then a symbol. Usually, most commonly, a
exclamation mark.
An exclamation mark.
Fuck, exactly. That's mine.
Right. There we go.
Capital letter, noun, 2 numbers, exclamation mark. I'm giving away my password, but anyway.
And exactly. And so we can write like that in terms of software code, takes it from bajillions of potential passwords down to very, very few, especially when you think that those are nouns that exist within the English dictionary.
Amazing. That's so true. I mean, you cut in half about 8 times what your potential search field is. And there's still, a billion searches here, but that's better than a trillion. Wow, okay, very true.
And I mean, it's easy to defend against if you just have a system that says, you've tried 5 times, you're locked out until you do something. That's an easy way to defend against it. But for systems that don't, it's a very effective, very cheap way to get access to an account or something.
One more definition. All of this rests on cryptography. So can you define this for us and explain its role in cybersecurity?
Okay, cryptography is a way to, we've been doing it for thousands of years, whether it be the Caesar cipher or the Enigma machine in World War II. Ways to take information and make it unreadable to people outside of a certain in-group. So with the Caesar cipher, you moved, the letter, a certain number of letters across. So A could become C, and B could become D, and that sort of stuff. That's important because at the moment, encryption is most important because we are now having more and more civilians and non-advanced actors using very advanced cryptography, very advanced encryption. So a lot of the messages that I send to friends and family, completely benign, but will automatically be encrypted. A lot of, you go onto websites that says HTTPS in the bar, that information is encrypted.
Oh,
and
cool.
there is currently a significant debate because whilst it helps protect us from cyber criminals, it can also help protect us. You know, if you live in a country that is a bit less free, it can also protect you from authoritarian governments and the like. I know that you've spoken to experts on government surveillance, but then there's the other side where it's like, if you do live in a free country where the rule of law is pretty good, then it makes it much more difficult for government and law enforcement entities to reasonably access certain and potentially very important data.
So what are you trying to say with that last point there? Are you referring to like maybe the Apple not being able to unlock its phone in a court case?
That's a perfect example. The terrorist attack in the United States. And I bring that up mostly because I think it's important to flag to your listeners where the current debate is and where that piece of information is going to be most useful for them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Lockie, in 2020, we saw more individuals and more corporations move en masse to the cloud than ever before, because everyone went to work from home because of the CVI. So this coincided with more cyber attacks than ever, but also correspondingly more attention to cybersecurity than ever. So this is a big, encompassing question. But what are the implications of this mass movement to the cloud, and then how has your industry responded to it?
Yep. So two parts to that. One is, at the moment, it's a bit difficult. And there are often increased potentials for compromise by, during the change, because the changes don't happen perfectly all the time. And you might make a change, you don't realize what's happened. It might happen that it exposes some information in a way that you didn't want. In the long term, I think it's going to be much better, because in the same ways you've got software as a service that can be updated remotely. In this way, you can have whole systems where you have outsourced responsibility for the security and often even architecture to the cloud. So long term, I think it's a great idea that not only gives companies the ability to change up their networks in a faster and more efficient and less costly way, which is great for developers and stuff like that, but also if I can give away the responsibility for the cybersecurity to like Amazon or someone, Amazon Web Services, for example, then they're going to be much, much better than 99% of companies and organizations that were otherwise doing it themselves.
Yeah. Okay, so basically you're just saying the answer to that is better options for individuals and businesses to buy into. You say software as a service, and so that's what the implications of the move, you would say.
Yeah, so I think it's particularly good long term because we're removing responsibility from individuals and organizations, which is great because it means that we can have the most up-to-date, as long as you download those updates. To all the people listening, please download those updates. The little box in the corner, just do it. That is one of the best things that you can do to increase your cybersecurity. If we can get companies to do that, then that's fantastic. If Amazon can say, we found a security issue with this particular product or whatever, boom, there's an update. That's now fixed for everyone. This is wonderful, but there will be birthing pains.
And this is also, maybe a little bit nitpicky, but there is also an inherent fragility to more people, say, going to use AWS, because if 75% of the people are relying on AWS and then AWS is attacked and successfully attacked, then there isn't a very well, the amount of people using AWS isn't distributed enough, so it is like a relatively minor attack. I don't know. Is there a better solution than just let's rely on the really big companies to do the job? For example, most of my work is in Google Cloud, and I assume that, they're going to do the right job. But it's also possible that overnight, my thousands of Google Docs could be wiped away, right? It could fail. And so I try to back it up on other things. There's a lot of fragility to us trying to rely on the cloud. I'm trying to get to that point a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely a centralization of risk, but it's the same as the centralized, like Fort Knox. You put all the gold in Fort Knox, you technically centralize the risk. But it's also the fact that the gold is probably safer in Fort Knox than it is distributed under everyone's bed. Well,
Yeah,
so
that's true.
Because in like the scale of which they're like AWS is so much better than so many other organizations, or AWS is the example. It might be Microsoft Azure or another provider, but I very much back it because I think that let's use the most advanced defense possible.
I like how you used the, if Russians walked into an Australian hospital with a bunch of AK-47s, Fort Knox is a place to hold your gold. You like to allegorize cyber security with very real world things that we understand from a physical threat perspective. Do you ever get sort of pushback or maybe a cynical response in trying to say that it's just as real as say the collectivized gold in Fort Knox is, let's say,
you're right.
ANZ's data being on AWS?
The costs of cybercrime probably far outweigh all the gold in Fort Knox. Australia, a relatively small country of 25 million people, cost about $1 billion in just ransomware, just that one kind of cybercrime, it was either 2019 or 2020.
Wow, okay.
But I think, the issue is that often these things are a bit complicated. Often people don't, they might not understand it. They're not specialists in it, and they shouldn't have to be. People shouldn't have to be experts in IT and cybersecurity in order to be able to safely live their lives. So I often find that allegorizing to things that they understand better just makes communication a lot clearer, a lot easier.
No, it does. And I really like the way you do it as well. And especially if you double down with that point that Australia alone, 25 billion people, like you said, very small population, had $1 billion worth of ransomware attacks in 1 year alone. Over time, that would be worth than whatever the gold deposits are. Why don't we hear more about it then? If Australia is $1 billion, I assume the States is several times more than that. Asia is several times more than that. I mean, why do we not hear more about these sort of ransomware attacks? If you were to poll the random person in the street, no one would know about it, really.
Well, that's particularly interesting, and I think it's changing slightly. I'll explain why. We don't hear a lot about it because it's difficult for a lot of people to understand, and therefore they don't read about it. Media companies are driven, you would know this better than most, online media is driven by attention, it's driven by clicks.
Yeah.
So if I put up a story that is a complicated and convoluted, jargon-filled explanation of a ransomware attack that you didn't actually feel in your wallet, then it doesn't really, it doesn't drive clicks.
True.
Where the conversation is changing is where there are those kind of non-financial things that happen. So the Colonial Pipeline attack was a perfect example because people were lining up at petrol stations, unable to fill up their cars, and they're like, why is this happening? Ransomware. What's ransomware? And then they've discovered that these things can happen. But it's also much more than, again, we're just talking about one type of ransomware. It's when Nathan Lyon breweries in Australia got hit with ransomware and they couldn't produce beer.
Yeah.
When, was it JBS meat producers got knocked over and they couldn't produce any more meats, and then there are meat shortages. I know in your part of the world there was a cheese shortage recently because of a ransomware attack. And then you go on to, they might not sound particularly impactful. I think some of them were, beef, meat, and cheese are quite impactful, but others might argue. Then you go to stuff like, all right, in last year in 2020, there was an attack on University Hospital in Dusseldorf. So they weren't able to take patients to the hospital. A woman was being taken to the hospital, couldn't go there, had to be redirected to a hospital that was further away, and she ended up dying. It's difficult to identify the causation there, and German prosecutors decided that there wasn't a clear enough causation there. But then also, when the WannaCry similar ransomware attack hit the National Health Service in the UK, 19,000 appointments, including heart surgeries, had to be postponed or cancelled. So there's definitely examples where these impacts are becoming more real, and that's because our real world and the online world is becoming more entangled. So impacts on one are being felt on the other.
I think you're spot on making the point that the reason more people might not know about it is because there's just too big of a barrier to entry. It's not that entertaining to consume. It's not like a car chase and a bank robbery. Although the allegory comparison might be exactly the same because it's some hacker from another country attacking a hospital, whatever. But you just brought up the NHS, which I would assume should, at least, it's a government organization, it's a national health service of one of the biggest, most important countries in the world. Why do they not have a level of security to prevent such a malicious attack? I get the sense that you might take the worldview that we're way more fragile than we should be. But if we just lean on your previous example saying, why don't we just rely on AWS, or what I say, Google, I mean, isn't the NHS relying on these places, yet they were attacked successfully?
So there's two questions there, Ryan. The first question, the first answer is that every single dollar that the NHS spends on cybersecurity is a dollar they are not spending treating, helping, and engaging in their core mission, which is to make people in the UK healthier and happier. So you can't blame them for, not having a gold standard and or not a platinum standard or whatever, and instead being like, you know what, there are people dying who need our help. That's our priority. That's our mission. That's why I think, and particularly with stuff like hospitals, because we've seen lots of them knocked over or lots of them compromised in the last few years. It's for two reasons. One is they have a lot of endpoints. So if they've got thousands of computers and stuff like that distributed across many hospitals or many sites, which means it's harder. Every single one of those computers, if any one person clicks on something, if anyone does anything, then the network's compromised. Yeah. I mean, it's happened to Australian Parliament House, which is the Australian Parliament House network has been compromised twice in I think the last 5 years. And in the most recent one, it's because one elected representative clicked on a malicious link. And luckily that was discovered relatively quickly and that sort of stuff. But again, this is like, it's the difficulty in when you've got thousands of computers and stuff, it makes it very, very difficult to secure all of those, what are referred to as endpoints, the endpoints of the system. Yeah,
it seems like almost an insurmountable level to secure as well. Do you think that... Let me ask this question, actually. Who's more sophisticated, the defense or the attack?
So it doesn't necessarily come down to sophistication, but there's definitely what's referred to as the attacker's advantage in cybersecurity. Because the attacker only needs to be lucky once, only needs to get in once. I was speaking to a red team penetration tester 2 days ago, and he said not once was he ever unable to get into a system. But more so, the attempt at the crime is so low cost and almost has no negative impacts. So if I'm some random, cyber criminal, if I can't break into your computer, I'll break into someone else's. And you know what? Almost no one's going to stop me. The police are almost never going to come knock on my door and say, hey, did you try and break into Ryan's computer? Naughty, naughty, naughty. We're hardly able to catch the criminals that do these massive attacks, let alone the smaller scale ones or the ones that don't actually happen, the attempted ones.
So we need to be better at preventing, more preventative, I guess, policing. Like somehow within the systems, we need to build a recognition of like, okay, an attack is happening. We recognize that we can then go and try and at least chase down the criminal here. It seems like, yeah, true. If you can walk into 10 banks in a day and just try and hold them up and then get sort of rejected out and not get in any sort of trouble, we'd be like, hey, how about you stop that guy? Because he's going to do something bad sooner or later.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. It's incredibly difficult. And it's it's incredibly difficult because the internet has expanded so far and it's still expanding. If you think about the fact that like all of these, they're referred to as IoT or Internet of Things, like your vacuum cleaner is now connected to the internet. And that's particularly, there was a number of years ago, a casino in Las Vegas. And they had a very large decorative fish tank. And the thermometer in their large decorative fish tank was connected to their network so that they could monitor the temperature of the water and take good care of the fish.
Yeah.
A hacker was able to compromise the security of the thermometer, because who would have amazing security on their fish tank thermometer, and then jump, because it's all on the same network, and then jump into the IT system of this casino.
Wow.
So like the what we refer to as the attack surface is increasing exponentially.
True. Yeah.
The opportunities for attack are increasing. The attacks are very easy and low cost. The cyber criminal business is very lucrative. It has like a low chance of you having negative repercussions, and those two things, unless we can change that cost benefit rationale, we're not gonna get any further.
So then what are we doing about the preventative crime? I mean, what are we doing to try and persecute someone who fails an attempted hack? Or is it just we can't identify him? That's the problem.
Mate, we are not even able to get all the people who are successfully pulling off large cybercrime operations. Whether it's because we can't identify them or whether they operate in jurisdictions that aren't friendly. Once we get the guys that are, or the cyber criminals that are actually able to pull off all of these, like the people that pulled off the Colonial Pipeline attack, there's been no prosecutions. There's been no.
Is there even an idea about who they are?
Yeah, so it was the Dark Side gang who have told everyone that they've definitely shut up shop and they're never going to do it again, and they're very sorry for all the inconvenience. They actually posted a note saying that they were sorry for the inconvenience and they didn't realize the scale of what they would do. But they're most likely rebranded as a group called Dark Matter. But this is what happens: is they just shut up one shop and then move on and do it again.
But that is an example of like the most sophisticated guys. I'm just imagining a random guy in Russia, North Korea, or even Melbourne, right, who is attempting to hack into people's systems on a small scale, not a government level, not a massive publicly listed company level, but just a more local level. These guys are also getting away with it. There isn't preventative measures to try and intervene here. And is it just a question of there aren't enough resources to do this? And that's ultimately
it's a question of resource allocation. Yeah. That's exactly what it is. And we addressed that, Weaving, in my previous role. In our first discussion paper, we said that the job is too big. And importantly, the government can't afford to pay the wages that the private sector can. So we need some sort of like part-time kind of army reserve sort of thing where people can come in one evening a week and help out. Like maybe go down to the local hospital, or you don't even need to go down, but assist the local hospital in uplifting their cybersecurity, stuff like that. But that we need to be thinking smarter about how to leverage the limited resources we have, because the person attempting to make, small scale attacks is never going to be high enough on the hit list to dedicate any of the very, very limited resources that the government and law enforcement have available.
But it sounds like whilst also the criminality side is scaling up, surely the private defense side is scaling up as well. And so you like, for example, the company you're working for right now and the hundreds of other companies internationally who are developing cybersecurity systems and consulting on cybersecurity systems for people. Could one just be of the sort of opinion that cybersecurity is while it's not new, our understanding of it is relatively new, and so in good time, there will be enough private businesses to counteract the criminal maliciousness on the other side, and it will just become a very lucrative business to be in. Cybersecurity defense.
So AusCyber, which is the Australian government-backed, well, not anymore, they're now a private organisation, but they are an accelerator for the Australian cybersecurity industry, have estimated that there will be 17,000 empty cybersecurity positions in Australia by 2025. Which
because of the growth of the industry.
Yeah, because of the need. And as a proportion, that's about a third. So we will have about 30% fewer cyber defenders than we need. Mm-hmm. Again, that's putting pressure on the government's ability to pay the wages because of that very, very high competition. True. So we think that, well, I think personally that it will get better, not only because we'll have more cyber defenders and stuff like that, but because our systems and way of doing things will get better. Mm-hmm. So, going back to what we were saying earlier, if people start to, move to cloud-based platforms, more people use multi-factor authentication. If there's one thing that people can do to protect themselves, it's multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication stops over 99% of account takeover attempts.
Oh, there you go.
So there's that. And the other thing, like when people, I use a password manager called 1Password. There's a number of other ones available, but password managers are also a fantastic option. As these become more commonplace, mm-hmm. as the defenses become more commonplace, as software as a service becomes more commonplace and those sorts of things, the IT ecosystem will become harder and harder to attack, I hope. But again, it's also increasing in size, and that threat, that attack surface is definitely going to increase as well.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess there isn't necessarily a precedent. If we're going to continue with the allegory of, and I don't know, I think allegory is the right word here. I could just say metaphor. It doesn't have to be too fancy. Of physical attacks versus cyber attacks. There isn't necessarily precedent of, say, the colonial pipeline having to fund and allocate significant amounts of their budget towards physical defense from attackers. But they now have to allocate significant amounts of funds for cyber attacks from attackers. So it is also it's a new cost for businesses. And that also might explain why there's quite a lag in the private sector meeting that demand, because people aren't asking for it. They're trying to, just do that. Just maybe fingers crossed. I hope we don't get attacked. I change my password every couple of months. It could be that kind of mentality. Does that make sense? Absolutely.
And then I absolutely, as I was saying with the NHS, their job isn't to be 100% cyber secure. Mm. Their job is to make people healthy or make people better. Listed companies, their job isn't to be 100% cybersecurity. They're there to deliver value for shareholders. Mm. No one, well, the company that I work for is, but almost no other companies are cybersecurity companies. That's not their mission. Yeah. That's not why they exist. So they're doing the right thing by only allocating as much as they think they need to.
But they're just underestimating how much they think they need to.
Exactly. And this is it's another risk, another business risk that hopefully
we lost Latin America. Sorry,
they're gone. That hopefully will be taken more seriously in the future, and I think it will. In the same way as people are generally becoming more aware of cybersecurity, I think that also extends to business leaders.
Yeah. 17,000 jobs by 2025. There is a bit of a precedent on this podcast. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Nassim. I don't want to take it down too much of a tangent, but basically the idea of a fallacy in prediction. So it's great that there is this, that you're putting out the signal, hey, there's going to be 17,000 well-paying jobs available, which we currently think aren't going to be filled. As someone who is involved in politics, and I think you also have like your career ambition is to be involved in cybersecurity at a what would you say, a national level, like to do it with the government?
I'd like to, if there's a way that I can scale up the positive impact I can have on cybersecurity, then I'll take it.
But like, I mean to say, you'd rather do it in the public sector than the private sector.
I think government is a very large and capable organisation, generally, and I think that the government, especially in cybersecurity, has a lot of unused potential for making the country and the world more cyber secure.
But the reason, and sorry to make you to ask maybe an uncomfortable question, a very diplomatic answer again. I think you're very well suited for it. But basically, I asked that question to say, what is then sort of the incentive to meet those 17,000 jobs? Are you like, does it go down to the university and you maybe offer more of a subsidy on this type of degree, or you just maybe can make Sydney and Melbourne, you can attract private cyber companies to Australia and make them build their offices there. What can Australia do, or what can any country really do to create the incentive so people want to get into cybersecurity on the defensive side, not the attacking side?
Yeah. So it has to be a range of different things. So you need to, as you indicate, support companies, and whether that's providing tax incentives or whatnot to private organizations to set up, fantastic. You need to work with schools and with universities by supporting getting young people interested and involved in cybersecurity. One of the things that I'm passionate about, and I think we particularly need to do, is get more women involved in cybersecurity, because if you've got an industry where half the population feel like they can't be involved and also be comfortable, then you can't be surprised if we have a lack of people getting involved in these jobs. So there's no silver bullet. I like to believe that if there were silver bullets to a lot of these big questions, then someone else would have already thought of it.
Sure.
It's where you need to have 1,000 different little things all working in tandem to try and get the outcome you want.
Nice. I think with on the female question, isn't it also the case that it's security, defense, and technical, 3 industries or fields which are quite male driven for very obvious reasons? I like what you were saying at the beginning about how in your master's thesis, or whether it was with Matt Thistlethwaite, you were suggesting to create like a cybersecurity force similar to the reserves. The Australian Reserves is, for those who don't know, basically like part-time military. You can do it on the side of your real job. I actually was, before I left Australia, I'd gone through the process and I was like accepted to be an officer in the Army Reserves, and I was super stoked to do it, but I left the countries. But yes, that seems like a really good way to go about things, right? Because if we're just going to think about this as a physical threat, like a nation's military are the best people to serve this purpose, are they not?
Definitely. And so it was with Tim Watts and Christina Keneally, who's another shadow minister in the Labor government. We put out a discussion paper on that, launched by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, with a number of preeminent thinkers, discussing whether that, amongst a suite of policies, would be a good way to address this. And I absolutely think it is. I think if you look at countries like Estonia, one of the leading kind of cyber powers in the world, despite being a very, very, very small country, they use they try and leverage those private sector capabilities in pursuit of kind of those national benefits. And I think that it's absolutely, there's no way that we can adequately fill the need for cybersecurity professionals without leveraging those non-government assets.
Lachlan, I really want to move on to the geopolitics of cybersecurity. So there's lots of sort of subtopics to touch here. But just off the top, you just signaled out Estonia for being a terrific example of a nation that's doing cybersecurity well. Is there a best country that is operating at the moment?
So that's difficult to identify. Countries like Australia are particularly, and most Western countries are particularly vulnerable to cybersecurity and cyber attacks because we have a large number of internet-connected devices. We have a large number of personal devices, a large amount of we have a service-based industry that relies on those devices. So the compromise of them creates significant negative outcomes for us. And then also we're a relatively wealthy nation. And so attacking like we are able to pay those large
Plenty
ransoms.
of supply.
There is a reason why the head of the Evil ransomware gang, pardon me, drives one of the ugliest things. It's a fluoro camo Lamborghini around the streets of Moscow. So if he wasn't a bad enough person for being a widespread, a terrible cyber criminal, he's also got terrible taste in cars. Exactly. So, yeah. Okay.
So, top end of the spectrum. Now, the other end of the spectrum. Who are the most egregious countries in cybersecurity? So, the attackers.
The attackers. So, it's interesting because, again, we have to divide it between kind of espionage and
very true.
Cybercrime.
In fact, divide it completely. Go just like private interests and then tackle espionage as a separate question.
So, in terms of cyber criminals, there's a number of states, most notably in the former Soviet bloc, the Commonwealth of Independent States, where criminal organizations, cyber criminal organizations, are kind of allowed to do what they want,
sure,
as long as they don't target the residents of those countries.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see this a couple of ways. A number of types of ransomware, if they will scan a computer, and if there is a Cyrillic keyboard on that computer, so if that computer runs a Cyrillic or like a Russian language keyboard, what the ransomware won't run. You'll scan the computer, and if it says this is a Russian person or Commonwealth Independent States, we're not running. Then also you've got examples where these organizations have targeted Russian or Eastern European targets, and then they've been swept. Those are the instances in which they've been swept up by the law enforcement. And so that's relatively egregious. And the reason that countries would allow that to happen is, one, it brings in money. So if your economy isn't doing too well, you can bring in external money and pump up your own economy.
Mm-hmm.
Two, it creates kind of, in the similar ways we were saying, cyber reserves, you can get kind of cyber militias, and these are referred to, actually, it's a growing trend of referring to them as cyber privateers, like the pirates that used to work for European imperial powers like the UK and Spain. But then also it can happen in places where they just don't have the capability to target them. So if you go to places like India, there's lots of examples of cybercrime coming out of India because there is a native English, lots of native English speakers, which means they can write good spam and phishing emails, try and get you to click on those links. But also, a lot of the time, the local police don't have the capability, or where they do have the capability, they're like, you know what, this might not be affecting the people I'm responsible for.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if these cyber criminals are targeting someone in, the US or Australia, that's unfortunate for them, but I actually have things that I need to deal with here. And so I'm going to prioritize my job, my immediate job, which again is to protect my local people.
Yep.
So there's a number of different reasons why countries would allow these cyber criminal organizations to operate out of their own territory.
Yeah, and then there's also like just the from say North Korea specifically, Russia specifically, there is almost an incentive to just anything you can do to weaken the big bad West, we're okay with it. And so there's also that aspect as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so that applies to Russia. In terms of North Korea, it's less cyber criminal organizations, and now we're definitely in between those 2 points of espionage and cybercrime because of the very punitive sanctions on the People's Republic of North Korea, or People's Republic of Korea, they rely on stealing Bitcoin, stealing money. The North Korean intelligence services undertook a very large, almost very, very successful cyber attack on the Bangladeshi National Bank.
Okay. Do you want to explain that for us?
It happened a number of years ago. They used the SWIFT, which is an international financial transfer system. They compromised that in a way. Unfortunately, the person writing the requests for the transfer requests screwed up a number of the syntaxes and stuff like that, and so a number of them weren't processed. But this is just another example. That money was then laundered through Southeast Asia and things like that. But it's just an example of where North Korea doesn't have a lot of money to pay for exports, for imports. So what do? They steal it. It was also particularly useful for them that during the cryptocurrency speculation boom, that South Korea was the leading country in the world for cryptocurrency purchasing. So I think they probably weren't too upset at being able to both increase their internal coffers whilst targeting South Korea.
Right, okay.
So they're a perfect example.
Yeah, go on.
Oh, I was just saying they're a perfect example of segue into discussion on espionage, but you go first.
Before we do segue into espionage, just to highlight for us, where are most of the criminals coming from that we know of? Is it stereotypically Russians and North Koreans? Or do we also have very sophisticated Americans, Canadians, Swedes? Are they also participating in this that we know of, to the best of our knowledge?
To the best of our knowledge, it's happening all across the world. Okay. The most advanced actors tend to be coming from the former Soviet Union. That's where the most advanced tend to be.
Okay, cool. Go on for espionage.
Espionage, I think there's the countries that you would expect to have the greatest capabilities tend to. So People's Republic of China, the United States, the UK, Five Eyes and Russia tend to have those capabilities. I'm a little less concerned about cyber espionage because, it's the same thing that's been happening forever, just via computers. Nation states have been spying on each other since nation states existed. It's not a crazy idea that they will continue to do so now that computers have been invented. They're able to do so at a much larger scale. So where previously you would have to physically steal information and in paper and take it out, you can now just download gigabytes or terabytes of data, which it's made the scale much, much higher, but it hasn't really changed the nature of the beast. So I'm personally less concerned about that sort of stuff, and because it doesn't affect kind of your everyday innocent civilians quite as much as something like cybercrime.
That brings up an interesting connection that I just made. We've been speaking about cyber attacks from the incentive of making money. Ransomware, give me money, I release your information. What about the other side where people are stealing information and then selling that elsewhere? Or with the espionage case, stealing information. Is a ransomware attack capable of doing this as well? Or is this a different type of cyber attack to actually get into a system, download its contents, and then leave?
So I'll answer that in kind of three parts. One, ransomware, yes, does that. As I indicated before, there's a lot of that double extortion going on, where I'll also download your data and then threat to release it, or tell your clients and stuff like that. So there's definitely that information exfiltration. But what also happens, and this is a bit of a bigger part of the conversation, is the specialization of the black market. So I might specialize in stealing people's credentials, so your name and password, your username and password, and then I'll just sell those. That's all I do. All I do is I sell usernames and passwords. Or I might be, because these ransomware gangs that we've been talking about, they operate what's also referred to as ransomware as a service, where if you pay them 20% or so of the ransom that you get, you can use their malware. So in
Crazy.
To go through kind of the whole thing. If you and I, Ryan, we decided we're going to start our own little cybercrime crew, what we can do, we can say, all right, I've affiliated, is what we call it. We've affiliated with this organization, this cyber criminal group, such as R Evil. We can then go out, we say, we don't want to do too much legwork ourselves. We're going to go out to either what's called, as we were saying before, the credential sales people, or what's called an initial access broker. So that's someone who's already got access to a computer, and they say, all right, if you pay me X dollars, I'll give you access to these computers. And so we could deploy crypto miners onto those computers. We could do a whole host of things. We could use that access to steal documents. But what you and I, Ryan, what we're going to do is we're going to deploy our ransomware. Mm-hmm. So we haven't touched a computer key now. We haven't written a single line of code. We've gone to 2 different salespeople and we've purchased their goods. Boom, we now deployed our ransomware on these computers and we get the money. Mm-hmm. If we were to do something else and steal those credentials or something like else, we weren't going to do ransomware, then we could just sell those credentials to, from the start of the story, we're going to sell it to the credential salespeople. And so then he can go and sell it on to someone else. So it's just this amazing specialization that's developed in the same way as we have specialization in the normal market. Specialization that's developed, which allows such scalability and lowers the threshold, lowers the technical requirements to cybercrime.
And it does allow, because it's all happening on the internet, it does allow for significantly more scalability than any sort of physical threat might actually be able to do. And it also...
Absolutely.
So you just explained how the market forces are working so seamlessly in the dark side of the market, where other criminal organizations are specializing and creating as-a-service products and so forth. And it's all made possible because of the crazy scalability of the internet. The equivalent in a physical type of threat never would scale to the same potential. The weapon could scale, like a nuclear warhead can scale pretty high, but like just the collaboration of people and the specialization of labor within it across different countries, different types of skills would not be able to scale as well physically as it does online with cybersecurity. However, I wanted to make this caveat and just ask, because what's the ethics of this? Because not everyone is predisposed to be a criminal. And even these guys, the dark side people who apologized after because they didn't realize how much of a problem they'd caused. They thought maybe they were just stealing money from big bad capitalists. What are the ethics here? Is it a fair assumption to make that because people are so far removed from the end person they're hurting, that more people are disposed to do it? Because it takes a pretty wild guy to walk into a bank, point a gun at somebody, and ask them to give them the money. But it doesn't take that wild of a guy to write a code and then do the exact same thing hypothetically to a massive business. So is this something you think about, or you guys speak about? The barrier to entry is so much lower, ethically speaking.
Yeah, so there's a couple of responses to that, and I think it's important when it comes to anything to do with cyber is that, and the reason the analogies are so easy is because there's almost certainly a non-cyber, non-computer analogy, and it's the same with all forms of criminality that are financially based. Is you have desperation. So in Australia, if you're a cyber criminal, you could probably do all right by working at a company, being a good guy. And there's also the increased likelihood of you getting caught.
Yep.
If you're a good computer programmer or whatever, and you don't actually, despite being really good, there just isn't a well-developed industry, the economy is not great, and despite your best efforts, you just can't get a really good job. As a good guy, as with all instances of financial criminality, you'll be driven towards behaviors that will, might be illegal but will get you paid.
Sure.
I think what you said is absolutely accurate. Where for two reasons. One is if you're on the other side of the world, I'm kind of distance from the material impact of those actions. But then also is if you're in, a small town in India, or if you're in somewhere in Russia or something like that, I am sure the gleaming, ideal of those Western targets that you're targeting. We know this because of chat forums and interviews that some of these cyber criminals give. They just say, you know what, you guys are much wealthier than everyone else, so we don't feel as bad. It's very much that Robin Hood mentality. We don't feel as bad targeting you guys, and I guess it is kind of difficult. If you take away the human impact of not being able to fill up your car at the petrol station, it's a little bit difficult to get in behind the big oil company and be like, poor Colonial.
Yeah.
They're a bit hard done by.
Yeah,
so
it's like you guys are insured for all this money anyway. It's not, whose money is it actually? It's easy to get to that conclusion. Yeah.
Exactly. So I can understand for certain criminal actors how they can justify these sorts of things for themselves.
Yeah.
But again, it's the same as it's exactly analogous to non-computer based crime.
You said at the start of when I introduced the geopolitics that it was actually Western nations who were getting the raw end of the stick. Kind of counterintuitively, you might always think that developing nations are the first guys to sort of be exposed here. What about, though, the developing nations? Because it's clear that Western nations have more money, and therefore they're much fatter, richer targets. But surely there are some malicious crimes happening to, poor African nations, poor Latin American nations, and they, I would assume, maybe it's a very prejudiced assumption, but don't have a sophisticated cyber defense as, say, companies on Wall Street have.
So cybercrime is geographically and particularly border agnostic. Computers don't know, they do know what country they're in, that's a lie, but the jurisdiction doesn't impact nearly as much. So the hacker that is able to target, some victim in Johannesburg is just as easily able to target someone in New York or Wellington or Sydney.
Okay.
And so given those two options, the threat actor or the bad guy, the criminal, is almost always going to go for the victim in one of the more developed countries. So
right.
It also just so happens that there are more endpoints to attack. There are more laptops, more computers. Our industries tend to be more connected than ever and that sort of stuff compared to the equivalents in more developing countries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. So even in that case, it's not very true that maybe, say, developing nations have a lower standard for cybersecurity and maybe doing less for their own cyber defense.
They probably are. Again, we've discussed resource constraints significantly, and if you are the government of a developing country, you probably have bigger issues on your plate.
Yes,
than
very true.
Cybersecurity.
Here's the most, for me at least, and something tells me for you as well, given your interest in counterinsurgency, the most fascinating part of the geopolitics of cyber, and that is cyber warfare. So, obviously it's a big topic, and I imagine, maybe I'm making too many assumptions here, but I imagine it's something that you've also thought and spoken about a lot as well. So where do you want to start on the topic of cyber warfare?
Cyber warfare, so I think, again, the easiest way to think about it is to break it down into its non-cyber analogies. So stuff like there's espionage, which we kind of discussed a little bit. There's sabotage. There's kind of battlefield communications, which we haven't seen too much of. But I think the one that has really kind of taken a lot of us by surprise is the impact on public sentiment within other nations.
Okay.
So the best example of that being the 2016 election of Donald Trump and all the misinformation involved around that. But,
cool.
So I think there's definitely a number of different ways you can look at it, but I'd be keen to talk about that because I think that's quite interesting. It's quite novel, and I think it's the most impactful.
Yeah, open up on it.
Okay, awesome. So there was again, to fall back on the comparative, disinformation operations have been happening for a very, very long time. The Soviet Union launched, or the KGB at the time, launched Operation Action, or just Action, if I don't want to...
Yeah, was that a Russian accent there?
Butcher the accent. But that was a multi-year effort to get out the idea, or the conspiracy theory, if you want to call it that the US had manufactured HIV/AIDS.
Okay.
That took, I think it was about 4 years to get off the ground, because they had to get people to write about it, then they had to launder that information through semi-reputable sources, kind of like maybe people working for certain newspapers that they had bribed or stuff like that, before they could finally get it published in more respected ways. Today, that happens in seconds. Today, you go, as we saw in 2016, you can be sitting in St. Petersburg, and we know the exact building that they were sitting in St. Petersburg, the Internet Research Agency, and you can organize not only a protest in Texas against a proposed Islamic community center, but you can also set up a counter-protest. So you can, from your seat in St. Petersburg, for less than $100, you can organize, I think it was about 300 or 400 people to turn up in the streets of a Texas city, I think it was Austin, and scream at each other.
Wow. Because it's all like manufactured hate on both sides.
Well, the thing is, it's not even manufactured hate. It's real hate that's just being amplified and
that's very true.
in an artificial way. So these people will believe these things, but the protest probably wouldn't have happened. There's the causality. The protest probably wouldn't have happened had these Internet Research Agency operators
not organized.
Yeah,
exactly.
And so they're able to sit back in St. Petersburg and have these people screaming at each other. And what does that do? That reduces people's faith in democracy. That reduces people's their feeling of investment in their society. It can even lead, we don't know, we can't do real hypotheticals about how it affected the outcome of the election, but it has most certainly affected stuff like COVID, where we've got examples of influencers being, social media influencers, YouTube influencers being paid to spread COVID misinformation. And that's from the playbook.
Wow.
You take,
being paid.
Here's being paid because some of them came out and told the press about it.
Yeah.
So we've got examples of them of an unknown actor, because we don't exactly know who it was, taking semi-legitimate information, giving it to a third party and getting them to amplify it in a particular way in pursuit of a particular goal. The speed at which this is occurring is astronomical. And one of the biggest kind of policy issues that's come out of this is now you've got all these people making and calling for and compelling Facebook and the other big platforms to become arbiters of truth. What are they going to take down? Is misinformation enough to take it down? When it comes to COVID, they've definitely come down hard because people are literally dying and refusing vaccines and that sort of stuff. But it is difficult, or I'm very wary of saying, this for-profit publicly listed company is now the arbiter of what is true and what is not in political discourse. So it's very dangerous no matter how you cut it. It's
uncharted waters there because, and this is more of maybe a political philosophical point, not necessarily anything with cyber. But if you are a YouTuber, Google, a Facebook, a private company, as you say, where everyone on there is just willingly there and happy to read and like whatever they want, the algorithm should be determined by a government or whatever. It's easy to say, leave that to market forces. There should be no policy intervention because it's a private company. But it's such uncharted waters. There never has been such an access to information like this before, Whereas if there was this sort of access to information before on a newspaper, if somehow the newspaper could have delivered all of the range of information, exactly what you wanted to see beforehand in the past, people would have regulated those newspapers. Policy is sort of necessary here. This is something that should not just be kept with the free market, because this example with Donald Trump in 2016, there's a fantastic book called This Is Not Propaganda by Peter Prometsev. I think I'm getting his last name wrong, but he documents this as well, exactly the Internet Research Agency, and how there are people paid to sit there and manufacture this information, creative minds to sit down, write these articles, to be given to sophisticated, not hackers, but just people that know how to move conversations and move information. And if like you exist on YouTube and Facebook and Google, and that's where all your information comes from, and these algorithms are actually giving you exactly what you want to see because you're telling them what you want to see again and again. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that they get misled and go down fucking bad holes and don't have the right information. And it ends up in a point where you're like, how can it be so divided that one person can believe that there is a genuine risk to getting a vaccine, but that genuine risk is extremely low, and then the other side saying half the people that get it are dying? You know, like there's too much of a gap in the middle there, and it's explicable by the algorithms feeding you exactly what you want to see, and it leaves me thinking
there's
perhaps it should be regulated.
Yeah, there's two reasons why that's actually getting worse at the moment, Ryan. Is we love to talk about 2016, and I did that first. It's not just the Russian government that's probably engaging with this. It's many, many governments, mostly authoritarian governments, who not only use it on their adversaries overseas, but increasingly use it on their domestic audiences. And then secondly, because we love talking about the free market, there are private public relations firms that are popping up that sell disinformation for hire, that will run these disinformation operations in support of private businesses or governments or whatever. And increasingly, these are harder to spot and harder again to prosecute, because the actual decision makers who are hiring these companies aren't getting prosecutors because they're all the way back there. So where we have been able to put down negative outcomes on the actors, it's never reaching back to the people who are actually making those sorts of decisions and choosing to hire these public relations firms.
Yeah. Can you speak to any examples of that, of a private PR firm who's actually a bunch of blokes sitting around a boardroom manufacturing disinformation? It's wild, isn't it?
Yeah. No, there's
so unethical too. How do you
there's an interesting book. There's an interesting book that I haven't quite got around to reading yet, but it's a kind of a memoir from a troll who worked for one of the Indian political organizations, and their job was just to do that. We've got lots of examples from the Ukraine, including in their recent federal elections, where basically every party had their own one. We've got one of the things that I think might be the worst was in Southern Africa, one of the Southern African states. A very wealthy family was being investigated in the media for quite significant corruption, and so to distract from that reporting, it's alleged that they hired a disinformation company to spread to kind of incite race-based violence.
Yeah.
And so the race-based violence knocked them off the front page pretty quickly.
That's unreal,
allegedly,
isn't it?
Of course.
That's actually unreal.
Yeah. So I think that whilst we love and reasonably do talk about nation states and governments doing this, there's also significantly more private actors who maybe are even harder to kind of combat, because often it's not even quite illegal to, sometimes it's hard to say, like, is it illegal to just post lies on Facebook?
So clearly disinformation, whether it's domestically or manufactured for international use, say Russia and America, or say domestically within the United Kingdom, Cambridge Analytica and the Brexit campaign is a very famous example. That's one arm of what cyber warfare, how it could manifest, what it could look like, and clearly quite an effective one, especially as it gets more sophisticated and especially if algorithms are left to just do their thing. So what else can we think about when it comes to cyber warfare? You mentioned a few things off the top there. Is disinformation really a big thing to worry about, or are there other things to concern about as well?
Well, I think disinformation personally is the biggest one to be concerned about because it defines the widespread actions of nation states and the way they go. But going down from very much the geopolitical level all the way down to the tactical level, increasingly we are going to be seeing the use of electronic and cyber warfare in disabling small-scale communications and the like in order to complete specific operations. So in that case, a good example would be a number of years ago, again, it's alleged that Syria under Bashar al-Assad had built a small nuclear reactor in the desert with North Korean expertise. And the Israeli Defense Force wasn't having a bit of that, and so dispatched a squadron of bombers to destroy it. I think the operation was called Operation Garden or something similar. The important and interesting part where electronic warfare comes into it was they were able to use some electronic warfare to send information into the Syrian air defense systems that made it appear as though there were no fighters there. So it wasn't a case of, using stealth bombers or anything like that, where the aircraft itself is producing less like radar activity. They were targeting, using electronic warfare, targeting the air defense systems and providing them with fake information. And so that allowed them to undertake the allegedly undertake the attack, destroy the location, and then leave without any being known. Yeah, so that's an example of kind of communications. And again, as warfare gets more advanced, it's going to be more about sensors and shooters. So being able to identify your adversary and then being able to attack your adversary. And if you're in a situation where you can disable the sensing capability of your opposition or your adversary, then that's going to give you a huge advantage. If you can stop their ability to deploy drones, if you can stop their ability to communicate with one another, that's always going to be beneficial for you at a very tactical level. Yeah. And then I think the third part is kind of your more traditional sabotage. So, for example, the Stuxnet virus is a great example where Iranian centrifuges being used for the enrichment of uranium were destroyed using a computer virus. So, sabotage has been they were caused they caused to run extremely quickly, and also for the safety systems to display everything as normal, and then they eventually destroyed themselves. We can see similar examples in Ukraine in recent years where the Ukrainian power grid parts of it were disabled in the middle of winter for a number of hours. So that's particularly concerning, the idea that a nation state could turn off your power, turn off the power to an entire city is quite concerning. So again, another example of where sabotage has occurred. And we know lots of other times where maybe it hasn't fully occurred, but where nation states have kind of gone in and planted malicious software in critical infrastructure of potential adversaries so that in the future they could use it if they really needed to.
That all just reminds me and reaffirms the point. Cyber highlights just how fragile a lot of our systems kind of are to manipulation and to attack. You use the energy example. I mean, I'm not sure if this is clutching at too many straws, but is an attack sophisticated enough? could even affect financial systems as well. And, you know, if you start getting at some of the fundamental building blocks of society and you start attacking them, I mean, shit, that can cause a lot of havoc. And that might be a great first or second step if you were to, you know, engage in cyber warfare against another nation. Yeah.
Well, I think I would hope that in terms of international relations and geopolitical strategy, in the same way as nation states might have access to nuclear weapons or to kinetic warfare, but then just not use it, I think that whilst we can say, you know, it's great that, or it's terrifying that they have access or the ability to turn off the electricity, I think that's not a precedent that nation states want to.
But I don't know.
Really push
I don't
too
know
much.
if that's. I don't know, because like there's an asymmetric upside to being the attacker there. With nuclear wars, nuclear warheads, it's mutually assured destruction. If you shoot, I shoot, we're both dead. Okay. But if I attack you first and you don't have a sophisticated enough attack back, I get to win this battle, and there isn't the same sort of threat on the other side. So I'm not sure if it would be totally equivalent to nuclear weapons in that sense.
Yeah, probably not totally equivalent. I think there are definitely precedents that countries want to avoid, insofar as stuff like, you know what, maybe we don't want to normalize the fact that we're all knocking each other's power offline every couple of months. That's probably not something
No, it doesn't seem like a good idea.
The thing is, this is why like counterinsurgency was so interesting to me as opposed to like kind of more traditional state versus state kinetic warfare. Is states are really like easy to target. Like Al Qaeda was really like, their thing was it was really hard to find them.
Yeah.
Countries are by definition super easy to find, and so they're really easy to find. And so especially with stuff like cyber, you always have to be thinking the other side isn't gonna never be able to respond to this. And so it's like, if I do this, what is the likelihood that, you know, a year from now I'm gonna be like, I really wish we could all put the genie back in the bottle and stop turning off each other's lights. And so I think that that is a important consideration, especially for those countries that may have less capability. I think you don't want to open that particular can of worms often.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Maybe I'm just being idealistic and hoping that everyone's going to be responsible international citizens.
Perhaps so. Let's keep our fingers crossed that it doesn't degenerate into the other way. But, you know, as like a nice broad macro theme, are you familiar with the work of Peter Zeihan?
No.
But he's not like a doomsayer or anything. But basically, he does document, I think, really, really well and very intuitively the sort of world order that has existed since the end of World War II, taking as an exception kind of the Cold War, but the sort of world order that America has ensured to allow the flourishing and prosperity that we've seen, and that all kind of at the very first principles level just comes from secure trade routes. The more we can trade, the more we can prosper, the more things can innovate, so on. The more we can specialize our labor, so on, so on, so on. And it gets to the point where we are now. But what happens when the disorder starts sort of flaking away? You know, I think what we've been speaking about, these cyber attacks, might start to have less of a downside as they would at the moment. And so it's all folly, it's prediction, but it's very interesting to think about. And what also I think is cool is that we have to acknowledge that these threats do exist, you know, whether it's at the individual level with my own personal information being stolen and then sold, or whether it's the company I work for, or whether it's the country that I'm within, you know, like these threats really do exist.
Absolutely. And I think you can't be idealistic about these things. You have to assume and prepare for the worst, or else you're never going to be in a position to deal with that when that comes. A different way to look at it, one of the things I love about cybersecurity and cyber, more generally, literature at the moment is there is like these very different camps who are talking about it. And I like to think that giving nation states more tools and more options is probably a good thing. I think that given cyber warfare capabilities give nation states the ability to choose responses or choose initial actions that fall below the threshold of kinetic warfare or kinetic strikes, and they're much more or less likely to cause human casualties and death. So I think, as completely antithetical to nuclear weapons, which you can only really get one outcome, and so whilst it's a tool, the only outcome that you're ever going to get from it is horrible. Yeah. Exactly. Whereas giving nation states the ability to little jabs at each other in the cyber realm probably gives them the ability to do more that they want to do and they're inevitably going to do without as high a likelihood of human casualties, which I think is a good thing overall.
Yeah, I agree. Lachlan, something you wanted to speak about was cryptocurrency regulation. And so I think it's very interesting, although I must admit that I don't necessarily have a formed opinion or much knowledge on this at all. So forgive me if I can't really support anything through this, but I wanted to hear what you thought about this and why it was important.
So I think cryptocurrency regulation is an important conversation that is just starting to happen, which is why I suggested we chat about it very briefly. There was some research done by academics at the University of New South Wales a few years ago that estimated that up to 80% of cryptocurrency transactions were done as some part of cybercrime or regular crime interactions. So because cryptocurrencies don't hold their value or they don't have any intrinsic value, very much they are either speculative investment vehicles or they are being used because you don't want to have your finances or these financial transactions occur within the traditional financial system. Probably leaves a high degree of probability that a lot of these transactions are happening because they're part of criminal activity. So, couple of things. One is the idea that are governments or international governmental bodies are they the best actors to act in this situation? I'd say yes. I think that only, especially given the international nature of the internet and cryptocurrency, you need to have international bodies get around and do this, or else you're just going to have kind of workarounds that occur through jurisdictions with fewer controls. I think there's also a precedent for states to target particular financial instruments in order to combat crime. So the example that I always like to use is bearer bonds in the United States, where as long as you've got this bit of whoever is physically holding this bit of paper is the owner of the money that was targeted because that was always being not always, but that was being used for criminal transactions. More recently, we've had governments target specific online ecosystems like e-gold for being overused in criminal transactions. So international bodies and nation states are probably good actors to do this sort of thing. And one of the things that's happening at the moment, which is being put forward and adopted in a number of different jurisdictions, including the European Union, including the United States and Japan, and a number of others, is what's referred to as the travel rule. And it says if you are a cryptocurrency exchange, any transaction that happens through you need to be able to verify the identity of the parties involved. So in the same way as when you set up a bank account in Australia, you need to be able to provide identification so that that bank account can be tied to you. These exchanges would need to do the same thing. Ryan, you were going to say something?
So basically, the reason why you think cryptocurrency regulation would be a necessary intervention is because most of the transactions are facilitating some sort of crime, and that's something that we want to stop. And one way that you can stop that is by identifying each sender and receiver on a transaction. But doesn't that then just just strike completely against the whole crypto narrative that it is the decentralized finance and it's your way to remove your sort of risk from whatever state currency you exist in. How do people respond to that as like a suggested form of regulation? I imagine not well.
Yeah, probably not well. And I've heard a number of crypto, maybe philosophers we'll call them, who have said the exact same thing that you have.
Yeah.
My issue is that I disagree with those people. So I think the role of the state is to intervene in certain places where there is a significant benefit that can be gained through the most limited restriction on people's individual freedoms. So where we're able to get a benefit for a very limited restriction on individual freedoms, I'm generally philosophically happy to do so.
Mm-hmm.
The proportion, and that's why the proportion of these transactions that are facilitating crime is so important. Because if in my, as I may make many enemies on the internet to say stuff like this.
It's a hot topic on the internet, yeah.
It is a hot topic. If you have the position that I have, where you're like, you know what, I actually don't really think that these are a legitimate investment vehicle, and then it makes it easier to take the position of, well, if these aren't so much of a legitimate investment vehicle, and if these are more of just like a way that people can either speculate or conduct criminal transactions, then that definitely seems like something that we should regulate. I don't see a huge benefit from being able to hide these particular finances from the government. Also, from an ecological perspective, I think cryptocurrency is terrible for the environment, and for the same reason as Elon Musk stopped taking payments for
Bitcoin.
For Bitcoin, yeah. And you'll be interested to know that Xinjiang is actually one of the centers of crypto mining in the world at the moment. Because it's very low cost of electricity.
Yeah. I spoke with Jeffrey Kane about that. It's fucking unreal. And also North Korea as well. What little energy they have goes towards Bitcoin mining.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's your like broad thesis for why crypto should be regulated and also how it should be regulated. Ultimately, the most important thing for you is just that there is ownership, like there's
identification.
Identification, precisely. So you know who buys, who sells, and that way there is that transparency. So if it is then used in a criminal transaction, you know who's involved. Great. How do you think it's going to play out? Is this something that the Australian government pays attention to? You know, are there people sophisticated enough within the Australian government to understand what this is and to understand the implications of a regulation? So
there's definitely people within the Australian government who know about this and are thinking about this, and I've spoken to a couple of them. And actually, the Australian law currently says that if you are changing Australian dollars into a virtual currency, then you have to be able to provide ID for that. So if you're doing it with Australian currency, it's already the law of the land that you do so.
So I own Bitcoin through an Australian broker. It's called CoinSpot. And I did have to provide my identification to create the account. But as far as I'm aware, that Bitcoin is not attached to me. If I was to exchange it elsewhere, if I was to remove it from CoinSpot onto, you know, my own wallet or move it to another exchange. So, you know, is the regulation taking that into account as well?
So, there's a good point. And that's also a point that comes up in the discussion of the travel rule, which is like, okay, well, what if I don't use exchanges? What if I just move it to like privately hosted wallets and things like that? The response that I always have to that is that, you know, this is not a silver bullet. But if an exchange is really one of the only ways where you can turn your digital or virtual currency into a fiat currency, then if you can't take that money out, then you're going to be much like cybercrime is going to be less lucrative, because it's no point having, you know, $1 billion worth of Bitcoin if you can't
a lot of transactions
take it out.
You change it to yen and then back to Australian dollars and stuff like that. Yep.
Precisely. So, and then you have to launder it more. And also the important thing is that every time you launder it and stuff like that, you're either going to lose money or you're going to have to pay someone and stuff like that. So very much so. And this is an issue in cybersecurity, because in cybersecurity, you get lots of technical people who like perfect solutions. And as someone who comes from policy, you never have a perfect solution. You just take the small marginal wins that you can, and then hopefully the end result is slightly better than the starting result. So the term usually used here is to throw sand in the gears. So if you can make laundering or taking out criminal wins, then that is a win that I'm going to take. I'm more than happy to apply maybe a small cost to people, like yourself, who had to register, so that if it was able to be tracked to you that was like criminal money, then the government or law enforcement would be able to investigate and say, hey, Ryan, why do you have this Bitcoin that could be traced back to payment for like a ransomware ransom?
Are you familiar with a guy called Eric Townsend?
I actually haven't heard that name, I think, but not off the top of my head.
He's been saying for a long time, he was one of the first kind of anti-Bitcoin guys to write a cryptocurrency book several years ago. And he's sort of just made the case, which I think is, which I can buy into a lot more, that whilst cryptocurrencies as they exist now, Bitcoin, Ethereum, whatever, will not eventually become what we buy our coffees with every day, nation states, Australia, the US, whatever, will create a cryptocurrency of their own currency, right? So basically it would get to the point where you never actually handle cash, because, you know, cash is kind of a personless transaction as well. You know, as you know, like in Mexico, famously, the underground economy could be as much as what the actual economy is, just because so much transactions happen in cash, and that's transactionless. It doesn't get taxed, it can be used for criminal purposes. You know, it's hidden transactions. I know I'm bringing up a lot of stuff here, but I'm in Sweden. I've lived here for over a year, and I haven't used cash once, not once. So, you know, they, I think, are already there, where it all happens through my phone. You know, I double click, it says face recognized, and I pay. Like, there's no cash, it all happens through the phone. It strikes me that this has a lot of cybersecurity risks and threats as well. So I guess for you, as someone in thinking about policy, moving from cash into all of our money being in online, I mean, that's a significant risk, right? And I'm sorry, I know I just said so much stuff, but take it where you want.
That's all right. Again, with the Fort Knox example, yes, there is like kind of a more concentration of risk, but again, the controls are becoming really, really good. So as you said, you check in with your face. So that's very, very difficult for someone to steal. If someone steals my wallet, they are going to be incredibly disappointed, because the card that they use can be deactivated like almost instantly.
True, yeah.
If they steal my wallet and my phone, they're not going to be able to access the phone. I'm going to be able to wipe it remotely from my laptop. And they're not really going to get a lot of use for it. They're also going to be particularly upset because I've dropped my phone many times, so it's probably not got a whole lot of resale value at the moment. But so, like, again, we're going back to the same old of what is the analogy to like the non-cyber version, which is that people can still steal money. They're just having to do it in a different way. And I think in terms of the underground or the cash economy, that is just becoming less convenient for a lot of people. I, like yourself, haven't used a lot of cash. I keep a dollar coin in my wallet at all times so that I can get a trolley at the supermarket. but I think that is about it. That's about the most cash that I use. And again, I don't even use like a physical card anymore. Mostly I'll just go out with my phone. And
nice,
with everything
same.
On my phone. So there is a bit of a concentration of risk, but again, in the same way as with cloud services, we're now outsourcing that risk and that responsibility to the banks. So now the banks, who are professionals and the best at protecting money, they are now protecting everyone's money instead of having people do it themselves.
Nice. Look, Lachlan, I think as an introduction to the world of cyber, I really, really appreciate you giving all of that. I think it was, a relatively decent deep dive, I would hope. What do you think?
I enjoyed it. I hope that your listeners enjoyed it. I hope it wasn't too technical, and I hope there's some concepts in there that people might go out and look at for themselves, most particularly if they could go out and look at multi-factor authentication and then password manager. I think that would be the best.
I like it. You're not selling anything here. It's just a public service announcement.
It is a public service announcement. Please do those two things.
And obviously there was more we could speak about. Like there's China's police state. There's so much there. But then, it kind of gets away from whatever maybe your core competencies is. But hopefully we can rely on you for the future as more cybersecurity news and big events are coming up.
Ryan, as I said before, I reckon these computers are going to be around for a while. So more than happy to discuss cybersecurity or tangential topics whenever you need.
Unreal, mate. So I've just got two more for you, which are baseline for every single person, not cyber related. Okay, so two questions everyone gets. What country are you most bullish on looking into the future?
What do you mean by bullish when you're
optimistic for? If you could invest in them, you would expect quite a decent return. And not financially, but just like, who do you think is going to do really well?
Yeah, not financially. Yeah. I'm very, very hopeful for India. They're the world's largest economy. They have a lot of historical similarities with Australia. Sorry, when I said economy, the world's largest democracy. Yeah. No, they're the world's largest democracy.
Yeah.
And they have their own struggles at the moment, but I think I am very, very hopeful that India will become a more active force for good in the world, not only lifting up their own citizens, which they're increasingly doing, but also, being more engaged in the international world order and trying to assist in promoting democracy through that.
Lovely. The first time we've had India, so that's cool. If you could witness a conversation between any two people, dead or alive of history, who would they be?
Okay, one of them would have to be Jesus. I think there's a lot of things that have been said about that particular gentleman that I'd like to hear. I'd like to hear verified.
I'd like to ask him to perform a miracle on request.
Exactly. I think there's definitely some questions to be asked there. Not sure who the other one would be. Maybe be funny to see him chat to Nietzsche. I think that'd be a pretty entertaining. Friedrich Nietzsche.
Friedrich Nietzsche. Oh, nice one.
I think that'd be an entertaining.
Oh my goodness! It would be. Exactly. It would just be abuse.
Exactly.
And Jesus would just sit back and say, "I forgive you, Nietzsche," and it would just infuriate him. How dare you?
Exactly. I think
forgiveness for the weak.
I think that'd be a pretty interesting conversation.
Nice. Well, Lachlan, mate, you've been so generous with your time. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Well, that was absolutely brilliant. I wouldn't be surprised if in a couple of years Lachlan is actually gearing up the cybersecurity division within Australia's military. It sounds like a pretty appropriate idea, actually, especially if you take the ongoing metaphor for thinking about cyber attacks as their equivalent physical attacks. We have a physical military, but if the threat moves to the cyber world, then we should also have a cyber military. And I think Lachlan is very ahead of the curve thinking about that. And hopefully with his political ambition, he'll be able to implement that within the Australian setup. Cyber attacks and cybersecurity are truly a major equalizer between the power of nations. Whereas before, the power of geography could protect you, more or less, or hinder you, or enable you. The ubiquity of cyber actually equalizes those natural advantages. So that was really the main takeaway for me. do yourself a favor. Take up Lachlan's advice. Get a double factor authentication in on your phone, because no one's going to help you more than you're going to be able to help yourself. So you've stuck around to the end, so you're an absolute legend. I would please urge you to leave a review of the podcast and subscribe to it. And most importantly, tell a friend. If you're interested in other stuff, I'm writing a lot online, and I have a newsletter that I periodically send out. You'll be able to find that. It's called Atlas Geographica, the website. You'll be able to find that in the podcast description. And I want to hear from you guys. So let's continue the correspondence. Reach out to me. You've got my email. If you swing by Stockholm, I mean, I'd be thrilled to get some beers with you. But furthermore, if you just want to start a correspondence, I am interested in hearing from you. So that's all. Tune in next week. Cheers.